Some anniversaries are meant to disappear. This one was buried so deep that the family had spent nearly 30 years pretending it never happened. And then, on a quiet summer evening, a 13-year-old boy walked into a garden and quietly dug it right back up. No cameras, no announcement, no permission from anyone whose job is to protect the royal image. Just a young prince, a handful of soil, and a single tiny flower that carried more history than almost anyone watching could have guessed. What Prince George did that night has now become the one thing the entire royal family cannot stop talking about. And by the time you understand why, you'll see it wasn't really about a flower at all. Before we go any further, if stories about the hidden moments inside the royal family are the kind of thing you love, do yourself a favor right now and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you are going to want to stick around for every second of this one, because the ending changes everything you think you know about King Charles. Let me set the scene properly. Royal wedding anniversaries that end in divorce are simply not marked. There is no toast raised, no old photograph quietly reissued to the public, and not a single line written in the court circular to remember a marriage that fell apart the way this one did. Charles and Diana were married inside St. Paul's Cathedral 45 years ago this very week, and yet nobody at Kensington Palace had planned a statement, nobody had scheduled a tribute. The date was expected to slip by exactly the way it always has since 1996, in total silence, unspoken, treated by the family as a chapter that closed painfully and was never meant to be reopened. For decades, that silence held. Everyone assumed it always would. Then came the evening before the anniversary. That's when George walked into the sunken garden holding something small enough to close inside a single hand. Nobody in the press office had signed off on it. No photographer stood waiting to capture it. Not one person keeping an eye on the memorial that week had been warned that anything unusual was about to happen. And here's the part that makes it land even harder. George is Diana's eldest grandchild, a boy born almost 16 full years after she died. He never met her. He never heard her voice. Everything he knows about his grandmother, he learned from photographs and from the people who loved her. Yet the object he carried into that garden had a wedding day history far older than either of his own parents. And honestly, how that little thing reached his hands matters even more than what it actually was. That single detail is what transformed one silent private visit into a story now spreading through the whole family like wildfire. So let me tell you exactly what happened. Because this isn't just a boy marking a date he had absolutely no obligation to even know about. This is the future King of England, at only 13 years old, choosing entirely on his own to fold his late grandmother back into the one royal wedding the palace has refused to acknowledge for nearly 3 decades. Think about that for a moment. Charles and Diana's anniversary has never once been publicly recognized since their divorce. Not with a statement, not with a single reissued photograph, nothing at all. So, if George's small gesture is allowed to stand, it becomes the first time in almost 30 years that anyone inside Kensington Palace has treated the 29th of July as a day worth remembering, instead of a day worth quietly letting slip away. Now, what George did that evening in the garden is remarkable enough on its own. But what it did to his grandfather the very next morning, once King Charles found out, is a completely different story. And by every single account that has come out, whatever crossed the king's face when he heard the news did not fade away quickly. Hold on to that thought, because we're getting there. Let's talk about the wedding itself first, because it needs almost no introduction. The 29th of July, 1981. St. Paul's Cathedral. The dress, the crowds, the fairy tale the whole world watched. But there's a smaller detail that almost every retelling of that day leaves out, and it happens to be the exact detail that matters most here. Since the year 1858, every single royal bride has carried a sprig of myrtle tucked into her wedding bouquet. It's a tradition that began with Princess Victoria, the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria, who used cuttings from a myrtle bush that is astonishingly still growing today in the grounds of Osborne House. Diana's own sprig, back in 1981, came from that very same original plant, and the custom goes even deeper. After each royal wedding, a cutting from that bride's sprig is sent back to Osborne and replanted. So in a very real sense, The same bush that provided the myrtle for Charles and Diana's wedding is also the same living bush that later provided Catherine's sprig in 2011. It's an unbroken living chain, passing quietly from one royal generation to the next. The royal historian Hugo Vickers once wrote that this myrtle tradition is one of the few pieces of royal wedding ritual to survive almost completely unnoticed into the modern age. It gets overshadowed by the glittering tiaras and the screaming headlines, and yet it has never broken since Victoria's day, no matter how happily or how badly any individual marriage turned out. That's the beautiful, stubborn thing about it. The flower doesn't care about scandal. It just keeps growing. Now here's where it gets interesting. The sunken garden at Kensington Palace, the very place where Diana's memorial statue has stood since the summer of 2021, was completely replanted before that statue was unveiled. And it was replanted deliberately to reflect the colors of Diana's own wardrobe, rather than anything generic or expected. But here's the crucial thing. By every convention, that garden has no connection whatsoever to the myrtle tradition. None. No ceremonial link, no precedent, nothing written down anywhere that could possibly explain what happened next. There was simply a gap, a missing thread, a piece of the story that had never been connected. And that is precisely the gap that a 13-year-old boy is reported to have quietly closed all on his own, on the evening before his grandparents would have marked 45 years of a marriage that had ended long before he was even born. Now, let me be honest with you, because these details deserve honesty. There is no official public confirmation of exactly how a sprig of genuine wedding myrtle ended up in the hands of a 13-year-old, just 3 days before an anniversary that nobody was ever supposed to acknowledge. But according to Hello magazine, which was the first to report the detail, the flower did not come from Osborne House at all. Instead, it came from a cutting kept much closer to home, inside Kensington Palace's own walled garden, grown from stock that descends directly from that same original plant, and normally reserved strictly for family weddings, never for memorials. And nobody has explained, on the record, how a request for that flower ever reached the gardening staff, or who exactly gave the approval to cut a wedding flower for a garden that has never once, in 5 whole years, hosted a wedding. But the request came anyway, and somehow it was granted. And this is the exact moment where a simple gardening story stops being a gardening story at all, because a source close to the household has revealed that George's interest didn't actually begin with the anniversary. It began weeks earlier. It started when the young prince came across a photograph of his grandmother on her wedding day, and he turned to his father and asked a simple question. What was she holding in her hands? And William, according to that same account, did not just answer him and move on. Instead, he is said to have quietly arranged the whole thing himself. No inquiry, no private secretary, no press office, nothing official at all. He simply made it happen so that his son could have a sprig of his very own. Just stop and think about what that really means. It was the heir to the throne, acting entirely on his own initiative, without telling a single person who is paid to manage the family's public image, creating the very first crack in almost 30 years of official silence about his own parents' marriage. A father, answering a child's question, quietly reopening a door everyone else had nailed shut. What happened after that has no official record at all. There is only a witness. 2 days later, on the evening of the 28th of July, with no press notified and not a single photographer present, George is reported to have walked into that sunken garden, accompanied only by one protection officer. He knelt down at the base of his grandmother's statue for less than a full minute. And here's the detail that gives me chills. He did not leave the myrtle on the plinth, where flowers are normally placed so they can be photographed later. No. Instead, he is said to have gently pressed it into the soil at the statue's feet, tucking it low enough that a visitor the very next morning would have to know exactly where to look just to find it. Then he simply stood up, said nothing that anyone recorded, and walked away the same way he had come, quiet, private, just for her. But one person did know exactly where to look, and within a matter of days, by a route that nobody at the palace has ever explained, the whole detail reached Hello magazine. Whatever George whispered, if he said anything at all while he knelt there in the fading light, has never been repeated by anyone who might have been close enough to hear it. That moment belongs to him and to her alone. But what happened to his grandfather, once that same detail finally reached the king, did not stay private for anywhere near as long. Here's where the story reaches its most powerful moment, so stay with me. Charles was told the very next morning, before his official engagements had even begun. And according to a source who spoke to the Daily Mail, the king did not say very much at all when he first heard it. He asked just one single question. He wanted to know exactly where, at the base of the statue, the myrtle had been left, and then he said nothing else on the subject for the entire rest of the day, not a word. But what he did instead speaks louder than anything he could have said. He quietly cleared one appointment that had been sitting on his diary for weeks. And he went to the sunken garden himself, alone, accompanied by nothing more than a single protection officer, on the morning of the 29th of July. Now, I know how small that might sound at first. A king standing beside a statue for a few minutes before breakfast. But please believe me when I tell you, it wasn't small at all, it was enormous. Because King Charles has never once been photographed at his former wife's memorial since it was unveiled back in 2021. Not on an anniversary, not on her birthday, not one single time in 5 long years. Camilla was not there with him. No statement was issued afterward. No court photographer had been briefed, for the simple reason that not one of them had been told to come. The only record that the visit ever even happened came from the garden staff, who just happened to be tending the very same garden that had supplied that myrtle 3 days earlier. And what they described was a man standing perfectly still for far longer than the visit strictly required, his hands buried in his coat pockets, his eyes cast downward at a small patch of soil, rather than up at the statue itself. He wasn't looking at her face carved in bronze. He was looking at the exact spot where his grandson had knelt. And this, right here, is the moment where a marriage that the palace spent almost 30 years refusing to discuss finally gets acknowledged, quietly, gently, in its own understated way, by the 2 people who actually lived it, and by the 1 person who never got the chance to. Follow the chain with me. William answered his son's innocent question about a photograph. George took that answer and turned it into a gesture at a statue. And Charles, the very next morning, appears to have gone to say something that no one recorded to a woman he married 45 years ago, divorced 15 years into it, and lost roughly a year after that. 3 moments, 3 generations, 1 flower, and here's the thing that makes the whole story so quietly devastating. Nothing about it looks coordinated in the slightest. And that is exactly what makes it hold together so perfectly. George's request began with a photograph, not an instruction from anyone. William's help began with a father simply answering his child's question, not a carefully drawn-up plan cooked up by image managers. And Charles's visit came a full day after everything had already happened, once he already knew what had taken place without him, and once there was truly nothing left for him to arrange or control. There was only somewhere to stand. 3 people born a generation apart from one another, each arriving separately at almost exactly the same instinct, and not one of them waiting for the other 2 to go first. That's not strategy, that's family. So what did this perfectly ordinary Wednesday actually accomplish in the end? It quietly restored a date that the family had allowed to go completely dark for nearly 3 decades. As a rule, the palace does not mark royal wedding anniversaries once a marriage has ended, and this particular marriage had ended not just once, but twice over. First in divorce, and then in something that nothing on earth could ever undo. There was never any obligation for anyone to remember the 29th of July at all. And so the fact that a 13-year-old boy chose to remember it anyway, completely unasked, tells us something genuinely important about how the next reign might one day hold on to Diana's memory, not through renamed gardens or grand official portraits, but through small, specific, deeply personal gestures that a child decides all on his own are simply worth doing. And maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside this whole story. It suggests that the family's relationship with this painful date was never actually resolved by 30 years of silence. It was only paused. It was only waiting patiently for someone young enough not to realize he wasn't supposed to mark it in the first place. Diana chose a sprig of myrtle for her own wedding when she was just 20 years old, plucked from a bush she probably never gave a second thought to again for the rest of her life. And now, 45 years later, her grandson chose that very same flower from that very same living lineage for a garden that was built to remember her. The circle somehow closed itself, and it was closed by a boy who never even got to meet the woman he was honoring. So let me leave you with this thought. Sometimes the most powerful tributes in the world aren't the loud ones, the planned ones, or the photographed ones. Sometimes they're the ones pressed quietly into the soil in the dark where only the people who matter will ever find them. And that, more than anything, tells us the kind of king Prince George might one day become. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think George knew exactly what he was doing, or was it simply a boy honoring the grandmother he never met? Drop your thoughts down in the comments right now, because I read every single one. And if this story moved you even a little, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves the royals, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next untold story. There are so many more of these hidden royal moments coming, and you are not going to want to miss a single one. I'll see you in the next video.